There's a question that hangs over every frame of Topeng Pemboros, this 2025 Indonesian martial epic, and it's not just who is strong enough to win the princess, it's something far more personal. If the only way to survive is to become the worst version of yourself in everyone else's eyes, how long before that mask stops coming off? How long before you don't even recognize who you were trying to protect in the first place? And the movie wraps that question in blades, silk, and the deafening clatter of coins spilling across stone floors, until by the end you realize this story about a fake spendthrift is really about the parts of yourself you waste just to keep breathing in a cruel world, and that's what makes it linger long after the last duel is over. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because this is the kind of film that feels different depending on whether you grew up with the sounds of gamelan echoing through your neighborhood or you're discovering this whole world of Junior Persilatan for the very first time, and I'm really curious to know how it hits you. So, Topeng Pemboros, on the surface, is the tale of Udano, a young man who pretends to be a reckless, wasteful, almost pathetic spender just to get by after his mother dies, and 15 years later, in a massive, brutal, and strangely ceremonial contest to decide the husband of Princess Aing, the truth about who he really is and what he's truly capable of begins to unravel like a piece of silk caught on the edge of a sword, and that unraveling doesn't just change his life, it sends shockwaves through the palace walls and across the entire world of martial clans and wandering swordsmen that this film lives in. Now, before I get deep into all the spoilers and all the emotional gut punches, let's just set the scene, because this movie doesn't open with a fight. It opens with something that feels deceptively quiet, a boy counting coins at his mother's funeral. And it's such a specific, quietly devastating image that you almost don't realize how much it's telling you about what's to come. The camera sitting low, almost at the level of the mat where she lies wrapped in white cloth, incense smoke blurring the edges of everything, and Udano's small hands are just methodically stacking these dull copper coins on the floor next to her, while voices in the background argue about debt, about what is owed, about who will pay, about how a woman who spent her life keeping the palace's ledgers could die with so many numbers still read in the book, and you see this little boy's jaw clench, the soundtrack almost completely dropping out except for the tiny ticking of coins tapping one on top of another, until his uncle roughly pulls his hand away and scatters the stacks, snapping, "Stop counting what you'll never own." And that's the wound this entire film grows out of, that humiliation, intertwined with mathematics and survival, because Udano's life is going to be defined by pretending he doesn't care about money at all, by performing wastefulness so aggressively that people stop looking closely at how carefully he's actually counting everything behind the performance. The director uses this prologue like a curse being laid on a child, and then we jump forward 15 years with one of the most stylish transitions in the movie. That same copper coin that fell from his hand at the funeral is suddenly flipping through the air in slow motion, caught in flickering lamplight, and we're no longer in a quiet house of mourning, we're in this chaotic, sweat-soaked gambling den under the capital, Suya Kenkana, with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, tobacco smoke thick enough to taste, and the coin lands on a table hard enough to make everyone around it go silent for just a second before they explode again into shouting and laughter. And sitting at the center of all that noise is the man this boy has grown into, Udano the spendthrift, the local legend of wasted fortunes and bad decisions, draped in loudly patterned silk, rings on every finger, a cup of arak perpetually in his hand, and the first time you see him as an adult, he's halfway through another theatrical loss, throwing away enough money in one night to feed a village for a month, and yet, if you look closely, if you listen to how the sound design bends around him, you realize that his eyes are not on the cards or the dice or the dancers around him, they're always on the people, always on the exits, always on who flinches when certain names are mentioned, and the movie doesn't underline that for you at first. It lets you buy the rumor, it lets you laugh at him the way the other characters laugh at him, because that's the trap he's built to survive in. This is something I really admire about Topeng Pemboros, it trusts the audience to misjudge its hero, the same way the world in the movie misjudges him, and that choice makes the later reveals feel earned, not like cheats. So even though I'm going to talk about some of those reveals in this review, if you haven't watched it yet, I'll say this up front, the first 30 minutes are designed to make you roll your eyes at this guy, to see him as this almost tragic comic figure drowning himself in pleasure because he can't deal with his past, and if you feel that, if you find yourself thinking, "Oh, I've seen this character before," the clown who secretly hurts inside, just stay with it, because the film knows you think that and it's playing a longer game. Now, in terms of where this sits in the landscape of Indonesian cinema right now, Topeng Pemboros feels like a bridge, like it's trying to connect the bone-crunching, close-quarters brutality that international audiences have come to expect from Indonesian action after movies like The Raid, with this much older, more mythic tradition of junior persolaton stories, the kind you'd find in old serialized novels or classic siren radio dramas, where honor and secret techniques and wandering heroes are as important as the punches themselves, and it does it by wrapping everything in a fairy tale structure. There is a kingdom, there is a princess, there is a contest to win her hand, but what's refreshing is that nothing inside that structure behaves exactly like you think it will, and that's where Princess Aing comes in. We don't meet her in some ethereal, romantic way. We meet her sitting on the palace roof, barefoot, crown tossed aside, listening to the distant chaos of the city at night, her ladies-in-waiting asleep behind her, and she's carving little notches into one of the roof tiles with a hairpin, each notch standing for a rumor she's heard about potential suitors, and she's already bored before the contest even starts, already exhausted by the idea that her life will be decided in some tournament that she's not even allowed to fight in. And that bitterness in her, that quiet rage contained under layers of etiquette and silk, is something the film keeps coming back to. She's not the kind of warrior princess trope that just picks up a sword and solves it that way. She's more interesting than that, trapped in a world where her intelligence is both valued and used against her. When the ministers talk about the contest, they say things like, her husband must be strong enough to protect her mind. As if her mind is a treasure chest they get to move around the chessboard, and the way the actress plays those scenes, with her face politely blank but her knuckles white under the sleeve, tells you so much about what this contest really is, not just a spectacle of strength, but a negotiation of power over her, and over the future of the kingdom. And speaking of the kingdom, the film's production design really leans into this blend of historical Southeast Asian aesthetics with just a touch of fantasy, enough to feel larger than life without drifting into full-on magical realism. So the palace of Suya Kencana is all layered courtyards and hanging fabrics and intricate wooden lattices, but every corner of it seems designed to either hide a conversation or echo a scream, and there's this recurring visual motif of thresholds, doorways, gates, spaces you pass through to become someone else, which is so appropriate for a movie literally titled The Spendthrift Mask. It's not a superhero mask, not a literal one he wears on his face, but a behavioral one, and yet the director keeps putting Udano in shots where his reflection is split or his face is partially obscured, showing him through beaded curtains or distorted in a sake cup, constantly reminding you that what you're seeing is a performance, even before you consciously realize it. The inciting incident that drags Udano out of his comfortable life of carefully calculated excess into the royal orbit comes, of course, when word spreads through the underbelly of the city that the king has declared an Adu Seika, a contest of blades and wit to decide the husband of Princess Aing, and unlike other films where the hero might be all noble and uninterested in glory, Udano's first reaction is pure, on-brand opportunism. At least on the surface, he sits there in the gambling den, half drunk, listening to the announcer read out the proclamation in the market square, and he laughs, saying something like, "So all I have to do is be the last fool standing and I get a palace, a princess, and a lifetime of free food? Sounds like a bargain even I can't waste," and everyone around him howls with laughter, calling him Pemboros Turkasi, the beloved spendthrift, daring him to actually show up. And there's this one guy, Raga, his closest thing to a friend, a one-time street thief turned low-level enforcer, who looks at him a little too long and says quietly, "You're not foolish enough to go near the palace." That's where debt never dies, and it's in that line that you start to suspect there's more history here, more reasons why Udano might have avoided the palace for 15 years, and the movie drops these hints with such restraint at first, letting you feel the weight of every glance. When Udano inevitably decides to enter the contest, it's not because he's suddenly grown a conscience or because of some love-at-first-sight moment with the princess. He hasn't even seen her yet. It's because his carefully balanced life is collapsing. One of the bigger gangs in the city, the Red Scale Syndicate, has realized that his wastefulness is an act, that the money he throws away is money he's cycling through certain tables on purpose, that he's been quietly manipulating the flow of silver between houses for years, and they want him dead, not because he's rich, but because he's dangerous to their kind of accounting, and in that sense, the palace contest becomes less of a goal and more of a hiding place, a stage big enough that he can vanish in plain sight again. And this is what I love about how the script layers things. On the surface, for the crowd in the movie and for a casual viewer, it's the classic setup, poor guy enters big tournament to win princess, but under that, it's also a story about a man running out of alleys to disappear into, forced to step into the spotlight because it's the only dark corner left. And the irony of that is so satisfying when Udano first appears in court as one of the registered suitors. The entire palace laughs at him, and the film lets that laughter run long, like uncomfortably long. You hear the murmurs, "He's the drunk from Pesa Jelap, did he pawn someone's house to pay the entrance fee?" And the camera just glides over all these rich, sneering faces before landing on Putri Aing, seated beside her father, expression unreadable as she studies this buffoon in gaudy clothes who dares to stand among princes and warlords, and the longer she looks, the more the soundtrack drops away until all you hear is this faint, irregular drumbeat, like her heart picking up on something she can't quite name, and she quietly asks her attendant, who allowed him in, and the answer is one of the first political threads that will matter later. Party Wisesa chose to open the contest to all who can pay the entry dues. "Your Highness," he said, "it would show the king's generosity." And Aining's jaw tightens just slightly, the barest hint of suspicion crossing her features, because she knows the Grand Vizier doesn't do anything out of charity. Party Wisesa, by the way, is one of the great antagonists of the film, played with this oily, perfectly modulated charm that makes every scene his intense even when nothing is overtly threatening, and he has his own plans for the contest, which we slowly realize have little to do with finding the best partner for the princess and everything to do with consolidating his own power. These political machinations play out alongside the more kinetic, flashy part of the story, the actual challenges of the competition, and this is where the film really flexes its action and visual storytelling muscles. The contest is structured over 7 days, each one with a different trial that tests a different aspect of a would-be husband, but again, the film constantly questions and subverts what that even means: courage, loyalty, strength, cunning, and uses those as opportunities to peel back the layers on Udano's mask. The first challenge is straightforward enough: a martial trial in the central courtyard, the camera swooping in from high above to show the pattern of concentric circles painted on the stone floor, each ring representing a loss of honor if you're pushed back, and we get this montage of fighters from different corners of the realm demonstrating their styles, everything from flowing, dance-like silat to brutal, chopping blows, and through it all, Udano stays on the fringe, yawning, making jokes, faking clumsiness, barely qualifying for the next round, and on a first watch, it's easy to think he really is just skating by on luck, but the editing keeps slipping in these tiny inserts, the way his feet adjust just before someone's move, the way he always seems to know exactly how much to fall without getting hurt, like watching a man pretend to trip just short of the edge of a cliff. And you start to get this itch in your brain: nobody is that lucky. One particular sequence that stands out is when he's pitted against a hulking champion from the mountain tribes, a guy twice his size with forearms like tree trunks, and everyone in the stands is already groaning, betting how many bones he'll break, and Udano does this theatrically terrified act, stumbling, complaining loudly about how this is clearly a misunderstanding: "I'm a lover, not a fighter," and yet he keeps just barely dodging these massive blows, until at one point he accidentally tumbles into a barrel of water that was left from the servants washing the courtyard, and everyone howls with laughter at the image of this supposed suitor drenched and sputtering, but the camera lingers on the water spreading across the stone, glistening just so, and as the giant charges again, Udano slips, slides, and redirects that momentum, using the thin layer of water like a deliberate stage, sending the big guy crashing out of the circle more from his own force than from any obvious technique. It's clever, it's funny, and it's the first time you see that maybe Udano's greatest weapon isn't his fists, it's his understanding of how people move, how to turn their assumptions into leverage. Princess Aing, watching from above, actually laughs during this scene, genuinely, the first time we've seen her react to the contest with anything other than boredom or quiet fury, and in that laughter there's something dangerous, because she's not laughing at his humiliation the way the nobles are, she's laughing at his audacity, and you can see the tiniest crack forming between her and the script that's been written for her life. But Topeng Pemboros doesn't just live in those clever set pieces, it also breathes in its smaller, quieter character moments, especially when it comes to Udano's relationship with his past, which keeps creeping in no matter how much he drowns it in intoxicants and gold. One of the most haunting scenes, for me, happens outside the official contest. Entirely, late at night, after surviving the second day's trial, Udano sneaks away from the palace festivities and slips into the old servant corridors, his footsteps echoing in spaces that haven't been used in years, and he ends up standing in front of a small, abandoned room filled with cobwebs and dust, and we realize, from the way his hand shakes as he touches the threshold, that this used to be his mother's quarters. The camera doesn't need flashbacks here, it just needs the way he crouches to pick up a broken abacus bead from the floor, the way his face hardens when he sees the indent on the wall where her ledger used to hang, and the way he whispers to the empty air, "I did what you said, Ma. I wasted what they counted," and that line hits differently once you've seen the whole film and understand the promise he made as a child. But even in the moment, without the full context, it's powerful, because it's the first time the mask actually slips when he's alone, the first time we see the disciplined, almost ascetic core under all the luxury, this man who has denied himself any real attachment or stability for 15 years because staying wasteful meant staying unpredictable. Staying alive. As a review channel, I have to talk about the performances here, because if Udano didn't feel real, if his duality didn't land, the whole movie would fall apart, and the actor playing him brings this incredible physical elasticity to the role. He's lanky, always a bit off balance when he's being Pemboros, with floppy, exaggerated gestures, but the second someone's back is turned, his entire posture shifts, his center of gravity drops, he becomes guarded and small, like a tighter coil of muscle and thought, and you can almost feel the exhaustion of living like that, of never being able to fully relax into either persona, and the film gives him enough close-ups where you catch those micro-expressions, the tiny flashes of contempt or calculation that leak through when he thinks no one's watching. Princess Aing, in contrast, is all contained energy, every movement precise because she's been trained her entire life to never give too much away, and that's why their chemistry is so interesting. When they finally share a real conversation, not just glances across the courtyard, it happens not in some private garden or romantic balcony, but in the palace accounts room, of all places. On the third day of the contest, there's a trial of reason and responsibility, where the suitors are each handed a mock ledger representing a small village's yearly resources and told to balance it fairly, deciding how much goes to the crown, how much stays for the people, how much is invested in roads or education or war, and everyone else treats it like a boring test, delegating to their scribes or just copying whatever they think the council wants to see. But Udano walks into that room and freezes, because those rows of numbers, the scratch of quills on parchment, the smell of ink and candle wax, all of it is a direct echo of his childhood watching his mother work late into the night, her fingers stained black, her eyes red with fatigue, and you can see the trauma rushing back, the half-buried math whirring back to life whether he wants it to or not. The scene is quietly one of the most intense in the film, with the camera slowly circling him as he stands there, ignoring the quill and instead mentally reconstructing the flows of money, the corruption implied in the way the numbers have been padded, the missing silver that means someone up the chain is stealing. And you realize that this isn't just an exam to him, it's a crime scene. That's when Princess Aing, who is overseeing this trial disguised behind a lattice screen so the suitors can't see her, breaks protocol for the first time and steps out from behind it, startling the scribes and guards, and she says, "Leave us," and everyone just kind of freezes, because she's not supposed to directly interfere, but she holds their gaze until they flee, and then it's just the two of them in this room full of ghosts, staring at each other across a table scattered with ink-stained papers. What follows is the film's first real duel of minds between Udano and Aing, and it's brilliant, because they don't flirt in the usual movie way. They don't trade quips about destiny or beauty, they argue about balance sheets. She asks in a cold, formal voice, "Why are you not writing, candidate?" And he, recognizing her but pretending not to, shrugs and says, "Because the exam is a lie. It asks me to pretend this village exists in numbers alone, but I can smell 3 years of drought in this ink, and 5 years of theft in whoever approved it." And the way he says it, half mocking, half deadly serious, makes her eyes widen just a fraction, because it's the first time someone has spoken to her in that room as if she isn't just the living symbol of the ledger's consequences, but a potential accomplice to changing them. They spar verbally, testing each other's understanding of how the kingdom's wealth actually moves, and through that, without either of them fully realizing it yet, they recognize something rare in each other, someone who can see the structure of the world they live in clearly, and still chooses to play it, rather than pretend it isn't rigged. And from there, the plot's gears really begin to click into place, because as Udano unwillingly reveals more of his true intelligence and skill, he attracts attention from all sides, allies like Raga, who sneaks into the palace kitchens to warn him about moves being made in the city, and enemies like Party Wisesa, who starts to suspect that the fool he let in for amusement might actually be the most dangerous piece on the board. This is where the film slowly peels back the central mystery of who Udano really is, and to talk about that, I'm going to have to go into spoiler territory, so if you want to go in completely blind, maybe pause here, check out the film, and then come back, because from this point I'm diving into the reveals that give Topeng Pemboros its emotional spine. Okay, so, throughout the first half of the movie, there are these fragments of information dropped about the so-called Ledgers of Blood, an infamous incident 15 years ago when a whole branch of the palace scribes were executed for supposedly manipulating the kingdom's accounts, paving the way for Party Wisessa's rise to power as the savior who cleaned up the books, and we know from the prologue that Udano's mother was a scribe. We know she died around that time, we know there was debt and disgrace, but the exact connection is left fuzzy until about halfway through, when Raga confronts Udano in one of the palace storerooms, furious that he entered the contest and put himself back on the regent's radar. Their argument is shot handheld, claustrophobic, the camera jittering just enough to make you feel like you're intruding on something real, and in the heat of it, Raga blurts out, "Your mother died for numbers that weren't her sin, and now you parade yourself under the nose of the man who ordered her hanging. Have you truly wasted your memory that much?" And that's the moment we realize that Udano's entry into the contest isn't just about hiding from gangsters, it's about him unconsciously circling back to the site of his original trauma, the palace where his mother was betrayed and executed as a scapegoat. Later, when Udano finally confronts one of the older scribes who survived that purge, in a shadowy courtyard lit by paper lanterns, we get the full story. His mother, Lestari, had discovered massive embezzlement hidden in the royal ledgers, money being siphoned off supposedly for border defense but actually lining the pockets of Party Wisessa and his allies, and when she refused to sign off on them, she was framed as the mastermind, accused of selling secrets to foreign enemies, and executed in a hurried public spectacle to calm unrest. Her debt, both financial and moral, transferred onto her surviving family. The survival strategy she taught Udano with her dying breath was brutal and simple. They can only chain what they can count, so become something they cannot count, and that's where the persona of the spendthrift was born, this man whose finances are chaos, whose decisions seem arbitrary, who never leaves a ledger for anyone to audit, because as long as he lives in that cloud of unquantifiable waste, is outside the system that killed his mother. Knowing that, scenes you've already watched suddenly take on a different meaning, the way he always insists on being paid in coin, never in written contracts, the way he burns IOUs after glancing at them for only a second, the way he refuses to keep a room or a lover for longer than a few nights. Everything becomes part of this vow to never again be pinned down by numbers in someone else's book. But of course, the tragedy and the beauty of the story is that to really challenge the corruption at the heart of the palace, to redeem his mother's name, he has to do the one thing he's been avoiding for 15 years. He has to let himself be counted, be measured, be known. That inner conflict explodes in the later days of the contest, particularly during the fifth trial, the Night of Mirrors, which is one of the most visually striking sequences in the film. The suitors are led into this labyrinthine pavilion filled with polished metal panels, reflecting and distorting their images, supposedly to test their ability to navigate confusion and temptation. And hidden among the reflections are masked assassins hired by unknown sponsors to thin out the competition. And the whole thing becomes this lyrical, deadly dance of silhouettes and flashes of steel. The way the cinematographer shoots this is gorgeous. Sometimes you only see a fight as a rhythm of light and shadow on the curved surface of a gong. Sometimes you see three versions of Udano at once, each reflection moving slightly delayed, like his mask, his true self, and his potential self all fighting different battles. There's a moment during this sequence where Udano, cornered by two attackers, has a clear opening to take one of their lives and doesn't, choosing instead to disable and disarm, and this isn't a mercy he's shown before in his rough-and-tumble street fights, so it stands out, and later we learn why. The assassins aren't random blades for hire, they're debt slaves bought from the same gang that's been hunting him, people whose contracts were signed off by palace officials. And killing them would mean accepting the premise that they are expendable tools, not victims of the same system that ruined his family. And the film keeps complicating our understanding of villainy like that, refusing to make it just about one bad guy. Still, Party Wisessa is the closest thing the story has to a central human antagonist, and the way his arc intersects with Udano's is both thematically rich and satisfyingly personal. As the contest progresses and it becomes clear that the fall from the city is not just surviving but excelling, Wisessa starts to investigate him, combing through old records, and we get this chilling scene where he sits alone in his private study, flipping through burned, half-destroyed ledgers from the Purge 15 years ago, his fingers pausing over a smudged signature that reads Lestari, and there's the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes before he snaps the book shut and orders his head of security to remove the problem quietly. This sets up one of the most tense sequences in the film. A nighttime chase through the palace grounds where Udano, dressed in ceremonial clothes too bright to hide in, has to evade Wisesa's elite guards, known as the Sapu Waja, while trying to keep his involvement in their deaths to a minimum, because if he's discovered covered in guard blood, the contest will be used as a pretext to crack down on the city's poor and criminalized. The choreography here is excellent, fluid, and inventive, with Udano using everything from laundry lines to koi ponds to slow his pursuers without killing them, and the sound design is once again a standout. Distant gamelan music from a royal party drift over the muffled thuds of bodies hitting the ground, creating this eerie disconnect between the celebration of order and the chaos just outside its light. What keeps all this action compelling rather than exhausting is how intimately it's tied to Udano's emotional arc. Every choice he makes in combat reflects his shifting relationship to his own identity. Early on, he always takes the path that maintains his mask, even if it means someone else gets hurt, but the closer he gets to Aing, and the more he learns about how deeply Wisesa's rot has penetrated the kingdom, the more he starts to prioritize truth over survival, until finally, in the climactic final day of the contest, he does something unthinkable for the boy who once swore to be uncountable. He steps forward in front of the entire court, blooded and bruised, and names himself not as Udano the spendthrift, but as Udano, son of Lestari, scribe of the Fifth Hall, openly claiming the lineage he's been running from. That moment lands hard, especially because of how the film builds to it. Throughout the second act, Aing has been conducting her own quiet investigation into the ledgers of blood, using her limited autonomy as princess to dig into restricted archives, and each discovery makes her more determined to resist the role of passive prize that the contest frames her as. There's this beautiful scene where she and Udano meet in secret in the hidden garden behind the old scribe quarters, lit only by the pale glow of fireflies, and she confronts him, saying, "You are not what you pretend to be. I see too much calculation in your waist," and he deflects, jokes, tries to maintain the persona, until she finally throws a ledger at his chest, one of the old books from her research, and he catches it purely out of reflex, fingers gripping the spine exactly like his mother's did, and the way his face freezes when he realizes what he's holding, what she knows, is heartbreaking. She doesn't expose him or blackmail him. Instead, she asks him a question that becomes the moral pivot of the entire story. If the world only recognizes you as a mask, who suffers for the things that mask does? And that's when he has to look at all the collateral damage of his survival strategy, the people whose debts were bought and sold while he manipulated the money flows for fun, the small-time gamblers who lost everything at tables he used as cover, the lovers he discarded casually because attachments were too countable. And you can see in that moment the enormous weight of guilt he's been studiously ignoring fall on his shoulders. It would have been easy for the film to turn this into a simple redemption arc, where love for the princess inspires him to become a better man, but Topeng Pemboros is more honest than that. Aing doesn't magically fix him, she challenges him, and he challenges her in return, forcing her to confront the limits of her own empathy. In one of their sharpest exchanges, she says, "I have always wanted to ease my people's burdens," and he snaps back, "Your people? The ones inside your walls? Or the ones whose names never make it into your ledgers? You can't balance what you refuse to see," and she's clearly wounded by that, but she doesn't retreat into self-pity. She rethinks her approach, and their relationship becomes not a fairy tale romance but a partnership of two dangerously aware minds trying to figure out if they can change a system without being crushed by it. All of this, all the emotional and political complexity, culminates in the final sequence of the film, the Dawn Reckoning, where the last two suitors standing, Udano and a fearsome general named Arya Sutriya, who has been Wisesa's chosen champion from the start, are set to duel in front of the entire kingdom at sunrise, in a ring surrounded by shallow water that reflects the sky like a mirror. Arya is the embodiment of everything the old order admires: disciplined, loyal, lethal, with a face carved in stone and a sword that has never known defeat. And yet the film has also given him enough depth that he's not just a cardboard villain. We've seen glimpses of his doubts, the way he flinches at some of Wisesa's orders, the way he looks at the people in the streets with something like shame, and that makes the final clash between him and Udano feel less like hero versus villain and more like two different survival strategies colliding: obedience and camouflage. The duel itself is stunningly choreographed, combining elegant silat footwork with bursts of raw, messy grappling, their reflections in the shallow water constantly rippling and fracturing as they move, and the score builds from a simple, insistent drumbeat to a full orchestral swell mixed with gamelan, brass, and metallophone hammering together like heartbeats and coins and war cries all at once. There's a moment in the middle of that fight where Udano has the chance to cheat, to use one of his old tricks, a hidden blade in his sleeve, a distraction with thrown coins, but he visibly stops himself, throws the weapon aside, and for the first time fights as himself, not as the foolish spendthrift or the calculating survivor, but as a son trying to stand upright in front of the memory of his mother, and that shift in him is mirrored in the way the camera stops using the tilted, swirling angles it favored for his earlier fights and instead settles into more grounded, steady framing, as if the movie itself is finally seeing him clearly. And this is where we come back to Party Wisesa, because he cannot allow a fair fight to decide the outcome, not when the stakes now include the exposure of his crimes. Throughout the duel, he's orchestrating a series of accidents, weak points in the wooden ring that might break under Udano's weight, guards ready to intervene under the guise of protecting the princess if things go too far, even a snipe hidden in the rafters with a blow dart dipped in poison. And the tension comes not only from whether Udano can withstand Arya's blade, but whether the truth can survive the regent's relentless manipulation. The final turning point comes when Arya himself, having been given the secret order to ensure the spendthrift's death by any means, chooses to defy it. In a quiet flashback that intercuts with the duel at its most frenzied, we see Arya overhearing Aing confronting Wisesa earlier that morning, threatening to publicly withdraw from the contest and abdicate her position rather than marry a puppet, and Wisesa responding by essentially admitting to the ledgers of blood, by boasting that numbers are the easiest thing in the world to kill, and the disgust on Arya's face as he realizes he's been serving not a kingdom, but a ledger of lies, sets the stage for his choice in the arena, when the weak plank beneath Udano's foot finally cracks, sending him falling forward, wide open to a killing blow. Arya's sword stops an inch from his throat, and instead of finishing him, he turns and drives the blade through the floorboard, pinning it in place and using the housing shock to hurl himself at the regent's guarded dais, shouting for all to hear about the truth in the ledgers. The chaos that erupts in that moment is almost overwhelming visually, with extra screaming, guards clashing, the king collapsing in shock, and Princess Aing standing up in front of everyone, her voice cutting through the noise as she declares the contest void and demands a tribunal. It could have turned into a mess, but the director keeps the emotional focus tight on Udano, who is lying on his back in the broken ring, breathing hard, watching everything he's feared and wanted unfold at once, his mother's name being dragged into the open, the facade of royal righteousness cracking, his own survival suddenly very uncertain. The resolution that follows is bittersweet, and I appreciate that the film doesn't try to tie everything up in a neat, happily ever after bow. Wisesa is not immediately executed in some satisfying splash of blood. He's arrested, yes, dragged away screaming that you cannot run a kingdom on kindness and chaos, but the film knows that systems of power don't crumble overnight, and it leaves some ambiguity about how much of his network will actually be dismantled. Arya, wounded but alive, accepts responsibility for the things he did under orders, choosing exile over a comfortable half-punishment, and in one of the most quietly moving exchanges, he bows to Udano before leaving, saying, "The weight you chose to carry is heavier than any sword. Do not waste it," a line that flips the meaning of waste from curse to challenge. As for Udano and Aing, the easy expectation would be that they end up married, ruling together as reformist monarchs, but Topeng Pemboros sidesteps that in a way that feels truer to the people these characters have become. In the closing scenes, we see Aing being crowned regent while her father recovers, flanked by a new council that includes representatives from the city's lower quarters, scribes and merchants, and even a former debtor, and Udano standing at the edge of the ceremony, no longer in gaudy silks, but in simple, practical clothes, holding a new ledger, one he chose to write. He's been offered a formal position as royal advisor on economic reform, with a stipend and a room in the palace. Essentially the institutionalization of everything he used to do from the shadows, and the idea terrifies him, because it means committing to being counted, to letting his actions be audited and judged. And in their final conversation, sitting once again on the palace roof where we first saw Aing alone, the two of them talk not about love in the romantic sense, but about debt, about what they owe to the dead and to the living. She tells him, "You do not have to pay your mother's debt with your whole life," and he replies, "And you do not have to balance this kingdom alone." And there's this brief, luminous moment where it seems like they might kiss, but instead they just rest there Foreheads together, sharing breath, and then the camera pulls back, leaving their future deliberately unresolved. Maybe they will marry later, maybe they won't, but what matters is the partnership, that they now see each other clearly, masks off, and have chosen to stand side by side, at least for now. Thematically, that choice is perfect, because the whole film has been about the danger of fixing people into roles: spendthrift, princess, regent, general, and the violence that happens when those roles matter more than human beings. The ending says, quietly but firmly, that they are more interested in the work than in the symbol, in the messy, ongoing process of rebalancing the scales than in a single triumphant image. Stepping back from the plot for a moment, I want to talk about the craft that carries all of this, because beyond story and character, Topeng Pemboros is just a pleasure to watch as pure cinema. The cinematography uses a lot of warm, earth-tone palettes for the city and the palace by day, terracotta, faded gold, deep greens, and then shifts into cooler, more metallic hues at night, with oil lamps and moonlight giving everything a kind of wet, reflective sheen, which makes sense for a film obsessed with mirrors and reflections. There are a few standout long takes, like one that follows Udano weaving through the market at sunset, exchanging banter, slipping coins to vendors, eavesdropping on conversations, all in one flowing shot that makes the city feel alive and dense and interconnected, and another during the night of mirrors that dances between fighters as they cross each other's paths without cutting, giving you this dizzying sense of 100 small stories playing out at once. The fight choreography, as I hinted earlier, strikes a balance between stylized and grounded. There are no supernatural wire-fu leaps here, but there are moments of heightened physics, like a jump that hangs half a second longer than it should, or a flip that seems a little too smooth, just enough to evoke the heightened reality of martial legends. The sound design is a quiet star. Coins never just clink, they ring with a slightly exaggerated resonance that makes every spill and toss feel significant. Blades have distinct voices depending on who wields them, and the use of silence is incredibly effective, especially in scenes tied to Udano's trauma around counting and debt. More than once, the cacophony of a crowd will suddenly drop to nothing when he's confronted with numbers that matter, replaced by a faint, insistent ticking that might be a metaphorical abacus, might be his own heartbeat, might be both. The score itself blends traditional gamelan rhythms and instruments with modern orchestral textures and even subtle electronic pulses, and it evolves as the film goes on. Early cues for Udano are chaotic, playful, full of woodwinds and irregular percussion that match his seemingly careless persona, but as we get deeper into his real self, those themes transform, slowing down, adding strings that carry a heavier emotional weight, so that by the time he stands in the ring at dawn, his original spendthrift motif is barely recognizable, mutated into something both mournful and resolute. On the flip side, Wisesa's motif is rigid, almost militaristic, a repeating pattern of metallic clanks and low brass, like a machine that never stops. And when that motif finally breaks, that moment when Arya turns on him, there's this striking musical beat where his theme stutters, literally skipping like a record, before falling silent, and you realize how much the soundscape has been telling you about power all along. Pacing-wise, I do have to say that the film takes its time, and depending on your taste, that might be either one of its strengths or its biggest hurdle. The first act is slow burn, spending a lot of time in the gambling dens and alleys of Suya Kenkana, immersing you in Udano's world before the contest even starts. And while I loved that sense of texture and lived-in grime, I can imagine some viewers feeling impatient, waiting for the real story to kick in. Similarly, the third act, with all its political fallout, investigations, and emotional reckonings, extends beyond the duel in a way that might surprise audiences used to more straightforward action climaxes. Personally, I think that length is justified by the thematic ambition. This isn't a film that wants to say, kill the bad guy and everything is fine. It wants to live in the messy aftermath. But I did feel a few scenes in the council chambers went on a bit longer than necessary, repeating points we already understood about how deeply the corruption ran. Still, every time my attention flagged slightly in those stretches, the film would cut back to something grounded and human: a worker in the palace kitchens reacting to news of Wisesa's arrest, a gambler in the city realizing his debts might be re-evaluated, and that kept reminding me why these political decisions mattered. From an acting perspective beyond our leads, the supporting cast is rich, if occasionally underused. Raga, Udano's friend from the gutters, brings this raw, slightly feral energy to his scenes, always looking like he's ready to bolt or bite. And his arc from loyal sidekick to someone who chooses to walk a different path, accepting an offer to help rebuild the city's debt records rather than continue hustling in the shadows, is subtle but satisfying. Nenek Mani, the aging madam who runs the gambling den and basically raised Udano after his mother's death, gets some of the film's best lines, her cynicism barely hiding a fierce, almost maternal love, and her farewell scene, where she gives Udano a bag of carefully saved coins, saying, "For once in your life, spend something on a future instead of an escape." At the theater I saw it inaudibly sniffling, even characters with just a few minutes of screen time, like the nervous young scribe who helps Aing break into the restricted archives, feel real, not just functional. There is one character that I wish had been developed more, a female warrior from the Western Isles who enters the contest disguised as a man and is quickly unmasked and disqualified, her storyline seemingly used to underline the sexism of the rules and Aining's frustration with them, but then she just kind of disappears from the narrative. I kept expecting her to reappear in the third act as part of some underground resistance, or at least to have a moment where Aing reaches out to her, but nope, she's gone, and that felt like a missed opportunity, especially in a film that otherwise seems so invested in complicating gendered power roles. Culturally, Topeng Pemboros has clearly struck a chord, at least from what I've seen in the conversations around it. There's been a lot of discussion in Indonesian social media about how it portrays debt and class, with people drawing parallels between the film's debt slaves, whose contracts are bought and sold by elites, and real-world issues around predatory lending, wage slavery, and the normalization of living on borrowed money just to survive. Some viewers have latched onto Udano's motto, "They can't chain what they can't count," turning it into memes and critiques of surveillance capitalism, while others have pushed back, pointing out that his early selfishness shows how hiding outside the system can also mean abandoning those still trapped in it. In that way, the film has become a kind of Rorschach test. Some see it as a call to burn everything down, others as a plea for reform from within, and that ambiguity is, I think, part of its strength. Internationally, it's also being talked about as another big leap for Indonesian cinema in the global market, not just in terms of action but in terms of narrative ambition. People are comparing its mix of palace intrigue, martial arts spectacle, and social commentary to things like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or even Game of Thrones, but through a distinctly Nusantara lens, and I think that's apt to a point, though I'd argue it stands on its own feet quite well without those comparisons. Visually, there are moments that feel almost painterly in their depiction of Javanese, Sundanese, and broader archipelagic aesthetics, and the film doesn't feel the need to translate or over-explain every cultural detail for foreign audiences, which I appreciate. It trusts you to either follow along or not, much like it trusts you to keep up with Udano's shifting personas. In terms of flaws beyond the pacing and the one underdeveloped character I mentioned, there are a few choices that might feel melodramatic depending on your taste. One in particular is the use of literal slow motion when coins fall during key moments. Yes, the coins are a motif, representing debt, fate, the randomness of life, I get it, but there are at least 3 instances where a dramatic coin drop gets the full near-freeze, hyper-detailed slow-motion treatment, and by the third time, I was like, okay, we get it, gravity is emotional. That said, the audience I watched it with seemed to love those flourishes, gasping every time. So maybe I'm just a bit cynical. There's also a late film twist involving one of the king's concubines being an undercover agent for a rival kingdom that feels a bit tacked on, clearly there to set up potential sequels or an expanded universe of Topeng stories rather than to serve the core narrative, and while it doesn't detract much, it does slightly distract from the very grounded, intimate stakes of Udano and Aining's story in those final scenes. But honestly, those quibbles are small compared to how thoroughly the film pulled me into its world and made me care about its characters. I walked out of the theater still hearing the echo of that refrain about counting and waste, and thinking about all the ways we, in our own lives, put on masks to survive economic and emotional pressures, and how easy it is to let those masks calcify into cages. Topeng Pemboros doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't say just take off the mask and everything will be fine, because sometimes the mask is the only thing that kept you alive long enough to even have the chance to take it off, but it does gently, and then not so gently, insist that at some point, if you want more than survival, you have to risk being seen, being measured, being held accountable. Udano's journey from a boy stacking coins at his mother's funeral, to a man who uses coins to hide from pain, to someone who finally uses his understanding of value to shift an entire kingdom's trajectory, is deeply satisfying. not because he becomes perfect, but because he becomes honest, both with himself and with others, and Princess Aining's arc. From a lonely girl on a rooftop listening to a city she's never really been allowed to touch, to a leader willing to challenge the foundations of her own privilege, is equally powerful, especially in how it refuses to make her just an accessory to the male hero. She's driving changes in parallel to him, and in some cases ahead of him, and their relationship, as I said, feels less like a fantasy romance and more like the spark of something that might survive the grind of actual governance, as a piece of cinematic storytelling. Topeng Pemboros impressed me with its ambition, its texture, and its heart. It plays with familiar tropes, a ragged underdog, a royal contest, a corrupt regent, but infuses them with specific cultural and emotional details that make them feel fresh. It's a film about money that treats money not as a crude plot device but as a complex web of power and morality, and it's a film about fighting that understands that the most important battles aren't always the ones with swords. If you're the kind of viewer who loves martial arts films purely for the choreography, there's plenty here for you, from the elegant courtyard duels to the chaotic palace chases, all shot with clarity and creativity. But if you're also someone who wants to chew on themes, to see characters wrestle with the cost of survival in an unjust system, you're going to find a lot to sink your teeth into. So, would I recommend watching Topeng Pemboros? Absolutely, especially if you're hungry for genre cinema that takes big swings both visually and emotionally. Go in ready to be patient with its slower stretches, let yourself be drawn into its world, and pay attention not just to the blades and the banter, but to the ledgers, the coins, the way people talk about debt and duty, because that's where the film's sharpest edges are. By the time the final coin hits the floor and that echo fades into silence, you might find yourself thinking a little differently about what you've been willing to waste just to get through your own days, and what it might cost you, and what it might free in you, to finally put down your mask. This has been Scenecraft Review, diving deep into the wounds and wonders of Topeng Pemboros, and if you've stayed with me through this long, winding breakdown of spendthrifts, princesses, and ledgers written in blood, I want to know what hit you hardest. Which scene lingered in your mind when the credits rolled? So drop that in the comments, share this with a friend who loves a good character-driven martial epic, and tell me, do you see yourself more in the boy who refuses to be counted, or in the princess who decides to reorder the count? Either way, there's something in this film that will hold up a mirror to you, maybe one you've been avoiding, and that, more than any sword fight or plot twist, is what makes it worth your time. Picking up where we left off, if the first part of this breakdown was about walking you through the bones and blood of Topeng Pemboros, its plot, its big turns, its sweeping emotions, then this part is more like sitting with it in the quiet after the credits, replaying scenes in your head, realizing they hit harder than you thought, and asking yourself why this story about a fake spendthrift and a restless princess keeps echoing like a half-remembered debt. Because the more you think about it, the more you realize that this isn't just a martial epic with a clever twist, it's a movie about the daily performances we all give to survive, and what it costs when those performances actually work. And to really get into that, you kind of have to go back to Udano himself, not just as a character who does cool tricks in fights, but as a deeply broken person whose entire adult life is one long, weaponized lie. Because what separates him from a lot of classic masked heroes in wuxia or silat stories is that his mask is socially acceptable. People love the clown, love the reckless rich boy, love the guy who buys another round, because he lets everyone around him feel smarter, more disciplined, more righteous, and the film leans into that uncomfortable truth. The world is often kinder to the wasteful rich than to the careful poor, and Udano twists that into a shield, turning the worst assumptions about him into armor. You see this in little micro moments that are easy to overlook on a first watch, like that early gambling den scene we talked about. But think about what's really going on there. He's not just throwing money away for the thrill, he's conducting a social experiment every single night, seeing who comes close to the flame of his generosity, who flatters him, who rolls their eyes when they think he's not looking, and he stores all of that, because even in his fakest moments, he's constantly mapping power, constantly reading people, and the more you re-watch, the clearer that becomes. Psychologically, that's exhausting. And the film doesn't shy away from showing that toll. It just does it without speeches. Look at Udano's eyes whenever he's alone, mid-morning, after a night of waste, when the hangover isn't just from the arak but from the weight of maintaining that persona. There's a soft deadness in them, this sense that when he's not actively performing, there is almost no resting self left. Only someone waiting for the next scene, and that's where his childhood trauma sits like a stone in his chest. because when your earliest memory of adulthood is being told that your mother's life is a negative number on a ledger, that who she was can be reduced to what she owed, it makes sense that you'd do anything to step outside the logic of counting, even if the way you do it is twisted. The film's decision to connect that trauma to something as mundane and universal as money is quietly brilliant, because it avoids the more fantastical tragic backstories we sometimes see in martial arts epics. No murdered sect of warriors here, no stolen secret manuals, just the boring, brutal reality of financial ruin, and that's so much more relatable. A lot of people know what it feels like to inherit debt, to feel like their life started with a deficit, like they were already behind before they even got to choose anything, and Topeng Pemboros taps into that, then blows it up to operatic scale, and yet, Udano is not painted as some saintly victim of circumstance. The movie never lets him hide behind his pain as an excuse for everything, and that's crucial, because his mask doesn't just protect him from the palace, it hurts real people. Think of the scene where a young gambler, barely more than a teenager, loses everything in a rigged game that Udano is using as cover to track a moneylender, and the kid looks at him with these devastated eyes, saying, "You said this table was lucky," and Udano just shrugs it off with a joke, tossing him a coin as consolation. And the movie doesn't immediately punish him for that, but it doesn't forget it either. Later, when Udano's starting to crack under the weight of his choices, we see that same kid again, standing in a debtor's line outside the palace, about to be conscripted into work he'll likely never return from, and he recognizes Udano in his fine contest robes, and their eyes meet, and this time it's Udano who flinches. There's no big confrontation, no monologue, just a silent accusation that lingers on his conscience and on ours, and it underlines one of the core tensions of the film. You can't live in a system without sometimes becoming complicit in it, even if you think you're just using the system to survive. That's one of the reasons Princess Aing makes such a compelling counterweight to him. She's born at the top of that system, in the very heart of the palace, and yet she's also trapped by it. Her intelligence and education turned into pretty ornaments in the same way Udano's recklessness becomes a kind of grotesque entertainment for the city when we first see her on that rooftop, counting rumors instead of coins, making little notches in the tile for every new name tied to her fate. The film is telling us immediately that she's someone who lives in numbers too, but in a different way. Where Udano's math is about survival and hiding, Aing's is about measurement and consequence. How many dead in the border skirmish she was told was minor, how many sacks of rice diverted from a famine-struck district to feed palace festivals, and the more she learns to read those numbers for herself, not just trust the reports handed to her, the more dangerous she becomes to the wise stars of her world. I love that her awakening isn't triggered by some romantic encounter or a single big shocking event, but by boredom and curiosity, by years of listening to half-truths and seeing the tiny inconsistencies in them, because that feels real. People raised in privilege don't usually have one dramatic moment where they suddenly get it. They slowly accumulate doubts until one day they're too heavy to ignore. Topeng Pemboros captures that in the way Aing is drawn to the archive rooms, to late-night discussions with tired scribes who assumed she wasn't really listening, and by the time Udano stumbles into her orbit, she's already halfway to rebellion. She just doesn't have a tool as sharp as he is yet. Their relationship, then, is less about him waking her up and more about them recognizing in each other different forms of exile. He's exiled from legitimacy by poverty and stigma, she's exiled from agency by gender and title, and if you want to get a bit literary about it, the whole movie becomes a conversation about who gets to write the ledgers of reality. One of the prettiest touches is how often the film uses physical, written ledgers as props in emotionally charged scenes. They're not just background dressing in the accounting rooms, they're slammed down in arguments, clutched like shields, thrown like accusations. When Aing hurls that old ledger at Udano's chest, it's not just a metaphor for her confronting him with his past, it's literally the object his mother died for, the book that carried all those false numbers, being forced into his hands. And the way he at first tries to push it back, as if it's hot, as if ink can burn, says so much without dialogue, and later, when he finally decides to accept the advisor role, there's a small, almost blink and you miss it moment where he sits alone at a table with a blank ledger in front of him, a clean page, and he hesitates, because for someone whose survival depended on leaving no trace, putting ink to that paper is like stepping onto a battlefield without armor, and that's framed with as much gravity as any duel. This is where the movie's larger themes around systems and individuals really hum to life. Wisesa is the obvious face of corruption, but what he represents is something more insidious, the bureaucrat who believes that as long as the numbers add up on the page, the bodies those numbers stand in for don't matter. His line about numbers being the easiest thing in the world to kill is chilling, not just because of what it says about him, but because of how recognizably modern it sounds. You could very easily imagine a contemporary politician or CEO saying something similar in a boardroom, and that resonance is clearly intentional. The way Wisesa weaponizes audits, investigations, and anti-corruption campaigns as tools to crush rivals while deepening his own control speaks to a world where transparency is only as honest as the people drawing up the reports, and that's not just an Indonesian problem, that's global. Topeng Pemboros uses its pre-modern, semi-fantastical setting to talk about things like austerity politics, debt traps, and creative accounting in a way that doesn't feel preachy because it's so tightly woven into character motivations. You don't feel like you're getting a lecture on capitalism, you feel like you're watching a very human battle over whose suffering gets acknowledged and whose gets written off as a rounding error. One of my favorite examples of this comes in that ledger trial we touched on earlier, where the suitors are asked to balance a village's budget. In many other films, that would either be played for dry comedy, look at the dumb warriors struggling with math, or skipped over as boring exposition, but here it becomes a moral crucible. You see different philosophies of power in how each man approaches it. Some think only of pleasing the crown, others genuinely try to help the villagers but still operate within the assumption that a certain level of extraction is just how things are. And then there's Udano, who recognizes the baked-in theft and refuses to participate in the fiction. That scene is quiet, no punches, no swords, but it's one of the movie's sharpest fights, because it's Udano versus a world view, and Aing is the referee, realizing in real time that someone from the outside world understands the stakes of her decisions better than the groomed prince who's been feeding her platitudes for years. Speaking of that prince, we should talk about the other suitors for a moment, because while the film obviously centers Udano and Arya as the most significant, there's a small gallery of secondary contenders who serve as reflections of different masculine ideals in this society. You've got the scholarly prince from the coastal kingdom, who sees Aing as an intellectual trophy to match his own cleverness. You've got the charismatic merchant lord who approaches marriage like a merger, offering trade routes instead of vows, and you've got that disguised female warrior I mentioned before, who crashes the party to prove a point. Each of them only gets a handful of scenes, but those scenes are pointed. The coastal prince, for example, has this memorable dinner debate with Aing about benevolent governance, and at first he sounds enlightened, talking about roads and schools, but then he casually mentions relocating whole villages for efficiency, and you see her recoil internally, clocking that he still sees people as pieces. The merchant lord flirts with her by describing her value in metaphors of profit and loss, which is both darkly funny and deeply gross, and the way she smiles politely while clearly storing that information tells you everything you need to know about why she's terrified of this contest. In this rogues gallery, Udano stands out not because he's obviously better. Early on, he might even be worse, but because he's honest about his dishonesty. If that makes sense, he knows he's playing a game, and eventually, crucially, he admits it, whereas the others are so fused with their roles that they can't imagine themselves outside them. And that question, can you imagine yourself outside the role you're rewarded for playing, is at the heart of almost every major character arc. Arya, the general, is so deeply entangled with his identity as the king's loyal sword that he can't see the blood on his own hands until Aing and Udano inadvertently hold up that mirror. His journey is about realizing that blind loyalty is a mask too, just one that's been praised as virtue rather than mocked as folly, and his decision to walk away instead of doubling down on that loyalty is, in its own way, as radical as Udano's decision to step into the light. Even Nenek Mani, who on the surface is just the tough but loving older woman who runs the gambling den, has a mask. She tells herself she's only in it for survival, that caring about the kids who come through her door is a weakness she can't afford, and yet you see her quietly paying for funeral offerings, slipping coins to mothers, protecting street girls from violent customers. There's a moment near the end, when the new reforms threaten to shut down the illegal dens, and she stands in the doorway looking at the official notice plastered on her wall, and she mutters, "So now they remember we exist." And in that cynical little line, you feel the sting of decades of being invisible to the law except when it's convenient. The film is full of those side comments, those tossed-off observations that reveal whole worlds of hurt and history, and that density is part of what makes it rewarding to re-watch. On a cinematic level, the way Topeng Pemboros moves between these intimate, character-focused beats and its larger set pieces is one of its greatest pleasures. Take the Night of Mirrors sequence again, it works as a sheer spectacle. Beautifully lit, creatively staged fights, but if you watch it as a continuation of the film's obsession with reflection, it becomes even richer. Every character in that labyrinth is confronted with distorted versions of themselves, and the way they react tells you who they are. Some swing wildly at every shadow, desperate to destroy any reflection that doesn't flatter them. Some freeze, unable to move in the face of multiplied possibilities, and Udano, true to form, starts by using the mirrors to fake himself out, throwing stones to create decoys, but gradually he stops looking at the glass at all, focusing instead on sound, on feel, on the real people behind the illusions. It's a subtle metaphor for his arc. At first, he's as obsessed with projecting an image as anyone else, but as the stakes rise, he learns to disregard how he appears and focus on what he actually does. The cinematography supports that reading by shifting how it uses reflections over the course of the film. Early on, mirrors and water surfaces show Udano doubled, tripled, fractured, whereas by the end, in the dawn duel, that reflective water around the ring is much calmer, and when we see his face in it, it's just one clear image. Even as the ripples from the fight distort everything around him, that kind of visual storytelling is what separates a merely good martial arts film from a great one. And then you have the sound, which I can't praise enough. The decision to give coins such a distinct, almost musical presence in the mix is not just a cute gimmick, it's a way of making the abstract idea of value and debt tangible. Whenever money changes hands in this film, you hear it, and each context has a slightly different texture. Coins tossed carelessly onto a gambling table have a shallow, echoing clink, like something hollow, while coins placed quietly in a widow's palm have a softer, warmer ring, cushioned by cloth. In one remarkable scene, when Udano is trying for the first time to write a new ledger honestly, every time his quill hesitates over an amount, debating how much tax the crown should really take, the faint sound of coins dropping intrudes into the score, even though there are no actual coins on screen, and it creates this almost subconscious sense of pressure, like the ghost of debt is standing behind him, reminding him that every number he writes will echo out into someone's life. And then, in that brief hush before the final duel, when everything is on the line, there are no coins, no numbers, just the soft slap of bare feet on wet stone and the distant thrum of the city waking up, as if the film is saying, for this one moment, forget the ledgers. It's just two men and the choices that brought them here. Musically, the score does something similar with its themes, as I mentioned earlier, but it's worth dwelling on how it handles Aing in particular. Her theme starts as a brittle, delicate melody on a suling, hovering over these strict, almost mechanical gamelan patterns, like a bird trapped in a clockwork cage, and as she takes more control over her fate, the melody grows stronger, dropping into a lower register, picking up percussive accents, until by the coronation scene it's no longer just floating over the rhythm, it's driving it, the whole ensemble moving to her tune. It's not loud or bombastic, but it's insistent, and it quietly flips the gendered musical expectations you sometimes hear in this genre, where female characters get soft, ornamental themes and men get the big drums. Here, Udano's music is actually the more fragile one, constantly shifting, while Aining's becomes the spine that holds the film's soundscape upright by the end. If we talk about pacing, and we have to, because a lot of people will bounce off any film over 2 hours if it doesn't move just right, Topeng Pemboros is walking a tightrope between being a propulsive genre piece and a patient political drama. Does it always get the balance perfect? No. There are definitely patches where you feel the movie circling a point it's already made, especially in the mid-third act council arguments, where different factions in the palace debate what to do with Wisesa, and we hear a lot of variations on we must preserve stability versus we must seek justice. You could probably trim 5 to 10 minutes there without losing any essential information. But I also think those scenes serve a purpose beyond exposition, because they show Aing learning in real time how to wield soft power, how to read the currents in a room full of older men who all think they're smarter than her, watching her shift tactics, sometimes playing the naive princess to lower their guard, sometimes dropping the mask and cutting through their euphemisms, is, for me, as satisfying as watching Udano land a perfect throw in the arena, and the slower pace gives those micro moves room to register. That said, if you're someone who comes into this looking primarily for hard hitting action on the level of The Raid or The Night Comes for Us, you might feel that the film leans more heavily on its drama than its violence, and that's fair. The fights are impactful and well staged, but they're not constant, and when they do happen, they're always in service of some character or thematic beat, Udano proving something to himself, Arya wrestling with orders, Aing testing boundaries. This is not a movie that throws in an extra brawl just because it's been 15 minutes. Without a punch, and depending on your expectations, that's either going to be refreshing or frustrating. Personally, I found it refreshing, especially because it means that when the violence does hit, it feels like a rupture in the social fabric the film has spent time weaving, not just another cool set piece, and that brings us to how audiences have been reacting to it. From what I've seen and heard, the response in Indonesia has been passionate and nuanced. Some viewers immediately latched onto Udano as a kind of folk hero of the exploited, the guy who uses the system's own obsession with spectacle against it, while others have been very clear about not wanting to romanticize his early choices, pointing out that he, too, benefits from structures of power, that even as a poor orphan, he still enjoys the weird privilege of being harmlessly decadent in a way many can't. There's been a lot of spirited debate about whether the film does enough to center the truly powerless, the debt slaves, the peasants who don't get to join contests or sneak around archives, and I think that criticism is valid. While we do get glimpses of their lives, the story, by necessity of its genre, spends most of its time with people who have at least some leverage, even if it's just the ability to move in certain spaces. But at the same time, I think the film is aware of that limitation, and it tries, in its final passages, to at least gesture toward broader change, the council reforms, the inclusion of lower-class voices in governance, the crackdown on predatory lenders. It's not a revolution, it's a reconfiguration, and that might feel unsatisfying if you were hoping for a more radical climax, but it fits the characters we've come to know. Aing is a reformer, not a destroyer, and Udano, for all his chaos, ultimately chooses to work within the palace, not burn it down. And that choice feels true to a man whose trauma came from the system, but whose skills were honed exploiting its rules. It's messy, and I like that it's messy. Internationally, the conversations have been slightly different, often focusing more on the film's stylistic flair and less on its class commentary, which is understandable when you're watching through subtitles and maybe not catching every nuance of how people talk about debt in Bahasa or Javanese, but I do think some foreign critics have underestimated just how pointed those elements are when a film sets its central emotional scar around something like a corruption purge that scapegoats lower-level bureaucrats while letting the architects of theft rise to power. That's not just generic greed is bad messaging, that's very specifically about how anti-corruption narratives can be co-opted by the same elites they're supposed to target. In that sense, Wisesa is one of the more sophisticated villains we've had in recent martial cinema, not because he's charismatic or good with a sword, he actually barely fights, but because he embodies a type of modern evil, the technocrat who can explain away anything with charts. There's a particularly chilling scene where Aing confronts him with evidence from the old ledgers of blood, and he doesn't deny the numbers, he just reframes them, saying, "If your father had not allowed these adjustments, there would have been famine, rebellion, maybe invasion. Sometimes one life, one name on a page, must be sacrificed so that the column does not go red," and the way the actor delivers that, so calmly, like he's explaining a mathematical identity, is infuriating because you've heard that logic before, in history books, in news reports, maybe even in your own workplace. And what the film does so effectively is show the human cost hiding behind that neutral tone. We've met the families destroyed by those adjustments, we've seen Udano's whole life twisted by his mother's execution, so when Wisesa calls it a necessary sacrifice, the hypocrisy stings doubly hard. By the time he's dragged away, shouting about stability and gratitude, you don't just want him gone because he's evil, you want him gone because you're tired of that particular lie. Any talk of sequels or spin-offs will probably end up orbiting around characters like Wisesa and that undercover concubine we glimpsed, and while I'm always wary of too many cinematic universes, I have to admit, the world Topeng Pemboros builds feels rich enough to support side stories. Imagine a prequel about Lestari and the scribes leading up to the Ledgers of Blood, a kind of palace thriller about numbers and loyalty, or a spin-off following Arya in exile as he confronts the damage he's done and maybe finds himself drawn into conflicts at the Empire's fringes. The concubine spy angle, while underdeveloped here, could blossom into a cloak and dagger narrative about information flows between kingdoms, showing us how Topeng Pemboros's themes play out on a more international scale. That said, part of me also loves the idea of this staying a self-contained story, its edges frayed just enough to feel like life goes on beyond the credits without needing to be fully mapped. There's a power, too, in leaving some threads unresolved. in letting us imagine for ourselves whether Aining's reforms will survive the next drought, whether Udano will still be at her side 5 years later, or whether the mask of the spendthrift will ever tempt him again when the work of being honest becomes too heavy. On a personal note, and I don't usually get this confessional in a review, but it feels appropriate for a film about masks, Topeng Pemboros hit me in a strangely specific way, not because I've ever pretended to be a wasteful rich guy, far from it, but because I recognized in Udano's performance of carefree recklessness a milder version of something a lot of us do, playing the clown, playing the easygoing one, playing the person who's fine so no one worries, because worrying people might mean being counted on, and being counted on means being counted, period. The way the movie ties that emotional evasiveness to very concrete structures of credit and debt is what makes it resonate. When Nenek Mani tells Udano, "You've turned your fear into a game and started believing your own rules," that felt like a punch to the gut, because it's not just about gambling or money, it's about any coping mechanism that outlived its usefulness. You start out doing something to survive, detaching, joking, spending, hoarding, and then one day you realize that thing has built a cage around you, and the door isn't even locked. You've just gotten used to pacing inside. Udano's journey is about walking to that open door and stepping through, fully aware that outside it there are new kinds of danger, like being accountable, like losing, like being hurt, and that's scarier than any knife fight. The film knows that, and it gives that step the weight it deserves. So when I think about Topeng Pemboros as a whole, its long runtime, its intricate plotting, its layered performances, its willingness to linger on quiet spaces between bursts of violence, I don't think of it as perfect, but I do think of it as generous. It gives you more than one way in. Maybe you're there for the martial arts, maybe for the palace intrigue, maybe for the social commentary, maybe for the slow-burn relationship between two very smart, very lonely people orbiting each other in a system that wants to use them both, and whichever door you choose, if you stay long enough, the film nudges you gently toward the others. That's what great genre cinema can do. It invites you in with something familiar and fun, a contest for a princess's hand, a scrappy underdog, and then, once you're seated comfortably, it starts rearranging the furniture in your head, and long after the last blade has been sheathed and the last abacus bead has been slid into place, what lingers isn't just the cool choreography or the lush costumes, but the questions it leaves you with. How much of myself have I spent on surviving? Which parts of my life have I treated like something to be thrown away because I was afraid of what it would cost to keep them? Who benefits from the roles I play, and what might happen if I stepped outside them, even for a moment? Those aren't questions a single film can answer for you, but Topeng Pemboros has the courage to ask them out loud, wrapped in silk and steel and the clatter of falling coins, and that, to me, makes it worth revisiting, discussing, arguing over, letting it bother you a little as you go back to your own daily performances. So if you've watched it once, maybe watch it again with an eye for the ledgers in the background, the way people talk about what is sewed, and to whom, the tiny gestures where characters almost take off their masks and then think better of it, and see what new debts you notice, what new balances you'd strike. And if you haven't seen it yet and you've somehow listened to all of this anyway, well, now you know the twists, but trust me, knowing the destination doesn't blunt the journey, it might even sharpen it, because you'll catch all the little foreshadowings and visual rhymes you missed the first time. Either way, this is one of those rare films that feels like it has more to give the more you're willing to lean in. And as someone who lives for stories that invite that kind of engagement, I'm genuinely excited to hear what you make of it, whether you think Udano ultimately did enough to atone, whether you think Aining's path is hopeful or doomed, whether you see Wisesa as an outlier or as a grimly recognizable type. That's the conversation I want this channel to keep having with you, about films that don't just pass the time but press gently, insistently on the sore spots of our collective imagination. So as we close this extended deep dive into Topeng Pemboros, into masks and money and the fragile, stubborn desire to be seen as more than a number, I'll leave you with the same question the film left me with. If you could choose one mask to put down, just for a day, which one would it be? And what might it cost you? And what might it save? Think about that the next time you hear coins clink in your pocket or see your reflection flicker in a shop window. And if this breakdown has made you even a little more curious about the stories you tell about yourself, then it's done its job. There is a moment in Topeng Pemboros where the camera drifts in, slow as a breath held beneath monsoon skies, and we find a boy sitting cross-legged on cool stone, rolling a coin across his knuckles as if he could roll time itself back across the calloused memories of his palms. Outside, rain scrapes the edge of a corrugated awning, stalls are shuttered, a stray dog shakes the wet from its fur, and the boy, whose name is Udano, stares at that coin not as money but as a mask, a symbol of how he will survive by learning to spend like a man who has more than he can carry, even when what he carries is only sorrow the size of a small home and a mother's absence that feels larger than the palace that looms far beyond his neighborhood's bamboo fences. And this is the seed the film plants in us before anything else, the audacious idea that sometimes the only way to live is to perform, to throw light and shadow onto your own face until the world sees what you need it to see, and that is the hook Topeng Pemboros wields with delicate force, asking not just what if a man pretends to be a spendthrift to survive, but what happens when pretending becomes a creed, and when a creed meets a kingdom's tradition, and when that tradition, at the beating heart of a selection fight to decide who will stand beside Princess Aing, starts to unravel and knit itself anew around the truth of a man who spent his life spending the wrong things away, because now he must spend what he has hoarded most carefully, not coins, but honesty, not silk, but silence. And as you feel the film's rhythm tuck itself under your ribs, as you taste clove on the air and hear the distant thrum of gamelan, I want to invite you into this world with me, the world this 2025 release conjures so vividly that you can almost look down and see your own toes wet from the courtyard's rinse of rain. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. The names in this film are softly carved out of memory and myth. The places smell of incense and iron and warm rice, and the cinematic choices run the spectrum from hush to explosive. But what frames it all is the story of how a boy who lost his mother learned a language made of lavish gestures, and how that language ushered him into halls hung with batik and power, where every set of eyes is trained to separate worth from want in a glance, to judge a blade by the shine at its hilt and a man by the manner he spends his cups of tea and his minutes at court. And if you are new to Indonesian cinema, or if you have been waiting for a film that knits the raw physical hum of persolaton with courtly drama and the haunted tenderness of a memory portrait, Topeng Pemboros arrives like a lantern lit downstream, saying follow, and we do, quietly at first, because the director, whose work feels like an heir to the great patient stylists of Southeast Asia yet very much its own voice, begins not with trumpets but with the close details of hunger and hustle. The way Udano, now older, tilts attention toward himself in markets by overpaying with easy laughter, tipping boatmen in the floating night bazaar beyond the city, buying a third cup of coffee for a stranger simply because there's a rumor attached to that stranger he needs to hear, and then running his fingers along bolts of fabric he cannot afford before buying an entire bundle as if the act is a shrug, knowing that someone is watching, always, and in this observation, he is woven into networks that keep him alive. He is no thief or con artist in the traditional sense, the film argues. He is a social alchemist, a man who turns spectacle into shelter, his performative spending into a sort of passport between classes and circles, and in a society where face and generosity are currencies as real as copper, he outbids misfortune with flamboyance. And the sound design tells us as much by turning every clink of coin and pour of tea into a small ritual drumbeat, a thread of rhythm that keeps pace with his pulse. We are told early, through the careful needlework of flashbacks, that his mother was a tailor whose hands held stories like seams, that she sewed costumes for Topeng dancers who performed at the edges of court festivals, and the image of masks enters the film not as a heavy thesis but as a beautiful inheritance, lacquered cheeks and smiling mouths with oval eyes that, when worn, allow a dancer to be many souls in a single night. Udano grew up among these faces, the film suggests, and when the night took her, illness, swift and unsentimental, the boy discovered that a mask can be more than entertainment, it can be a raft, and he climbed on that raft into the adolescent tide of the city's narrow lanes where every decision is a trade, every gesture a calculation, every showy expense a way to telegraph that he has no need to be stolen from because he is always moving, always connected, always too expensive a complication to touch. By the time we meet him 15 years later, the palace's red lacquer gates have closed around the opening festivities for an announcement that will ripple the world of Silat, of code and clan and honor, because Princess Aing, educated in both poetry and archery, strong-legged and steel-eyed, has decided upon a selection like no other, not a mere parade of noble families and their sons, not a single duel, not a riddle poem tied with red string, but a series of trials that will test the mettle of any man's ability to read a room, read a river, read himself, and the world of persolaton hears of it and thrums, because the rules of the martial world are being invited into a new conversation with governance, with a woman's agency, with what it means to stand beside power rather than simply grasp for it, and Udano, whose flirtations with the palace through the back door, supplying discreet items for parties thrown by courtiers who like the way he entertains without intruding, places him in the orbit of this event, finds himself roped, not by desire for a title but by the long leash of debt, into stepping into a circle he has always skirted. The film is careful here not to turn him into a reluctant hero by rote. The writing likes ambiguity. It trails him at a distance, showing the way he calculates how a public appearance in the field of suitors could erase obligations faster than a year's worth of favors, how the face of a spendthrift can become a mask worn directly into the heart of decisions, and how Princess Aing, from the opening crest of her first scene, is not a figure to be won so much as a mind to be met. She watches as people watch her. She lets silence do its long work, and when she speaks, the court leans as if listening to a night bird. The cinematography during these early scenes is a smooth river of long takes that never sensationalizes the ornate. We learn something about Udano's mother that reframes the coat of his grief into a banner of quiet defiance. We learn something about Princess Aing's education that we suspected but could not prove, and the champion we feared would be a two-dimensional symbol of muscle gets a sentence that breaks him into complexity, a single sentence about losing a teacher and mistaking violence in the world as an invitation for more of it. And that's when I felt the film slide into a rare place for a genre piece, a place where everyone is allowed to be human while still being archetypes who carry meaning across the river. Let's talk about the cinematic aspects, because if you love the feeling of craft meeting purpose, this is one of those films where you feel the collaborators share a single breath. The camera is a dancer, not a voyeur, and when it enters a fight it does not thrash with us, it finds a diagonal and stays. It trusts the choreography to tell you what you need to know, and the editing's confidence in letting an exchange take place is the best kind of confidence, the kind that honors bodies learning each other in motion. The colors are a love letter to earth and fruit and dusk, saffron-bathed kitchens, teal-shadowed hallways, the deep beet red of waxed batik, the black of rain-sucked hair shivering under the eaves, and you sense that the production design understands how to tell story with fabric, with the placement of a single woven basket on a threshold, with the way Princess Aing's chair is made of a wood that flexes just enough to creak when she leans forward to speak. The music is a character as much as any person on screen. It is gamelan that has chosen patience, drought slow, clacking in irregular patterns when tension mounts, not because fear is simple but because fear, in this film, has texture, and the flutes crosshatch the metal and the drums tap in through the soles of your feet until you realize your breathing has been replaced by someone else's for a while. So aligned are you with the tempo of a scene. On a second watch, I caught the way the score withholds the high bell until Udano tells the truth for the first time in a room that could punish it, and the bell becomes a signal that truth has a sound the court cannot ignore. As for performances, I have to marvel at the actor who embodies Udano, because charisma like this reads even in the negative spaces. His most compelling scenes are the ones where he is still and the world turns around him like a wheel on a potter's hand, and when he moves, it is economical, a man who has learned that the most expensive gesture is a waste when a cheaper one will do. A philosophy he abandons with immense weight precisely when the story calls for him to spend everything. The actress who animates Princess Aing goes past royalty into a kind of scholar-warrior equilibrium. Every glance from her feels like a notation added to a margin, a selection scored with compassion and wit, and her scenes with Udano crackle not with a romance expected by formula but with an alliance being tested, respect meeting a human who uses his mask to protect a vulnerability she can taste in the air. And their final exchange, which I will not reveal, is one of the loveliest arguments I've seen about power dressed up as tenderness. The supporting cast is a feast of faces that you would happily follow into spin-offs, the clerk with the gait of someone used to dodging larger feet, the fishmonger turned reluctant mentor whose voice seems always to be about to break into a song she never bothers to sing, the champion whose hands tremble when nobody's looking, the steward in the grey tunic who betrays someone he loves because the palace taught him that order will only listen to proof of loyalty in the currency of pain. The film has a way of letting these people share their small, precise truths, sometimes in a line carved like a warung spoon, sometimes in the way they carry a tray or mispunch a drum pattern or flinch before they accept an embrace. Pacing is where some audiences will draw their lines, and I'll be transparent because that's what I want from reviewers I listen to. The first act is measured like a day in a slow kitchen. You hear the cutting, the mortar's hum, the oil's patience before it accepts heat, and if you meet the film's invitation, it rewards you with a second act that needles forward in the shape of trials that were advertised as selection but are actually an intervention staged by a future monarch who would rather choose a partner than a trophy. By the third act, the film lifts its head and lets weather in, and you might feel, as I did, that the final 40 minutes are not a crescendo so much as a cascade, more like a pack of decisions made in concert, a river picking one of its old ways around a bend, and that might feel less than bombastic to viewers who crave a tournament supercut and a coronation. For me, it was Writer. A film about masks should end with people's faces discovered in a room with the windows open. Thematically, The Mask is obvious by title but complex in execution, because Topeng Pemboros is not content to say that we wear masks in society. We know that already. The film wants to weigh what happens when our community rewards a mask so much that you can forget the face. It asks how poverty makes performance a necessity, how generosity used as armor is both holy and perilous, how a man spends as a question to the world about his value and waits to hear how the world replies with invitations or knives. It also shows us what happens when a woman born into a structure chooses to adjust the geometry of that structure, when she uses tradition not as a cage but as scaffolding, when she invites the old choreography to dance a new song and thereby respects it enough to keep it alive while refusing to bow to its worst habits. A particular line that haunted me, translated in the subtitles with a grace that captures the lilt, is when Udano, faced with returning to the mask once more to survive a lie, says quietly that he spends because his mother did not believe in saving a face that did not feed a belly, and the princess replies that she will build a hall where faces can rest and bellies can be filled without debt to spectacle. And you feel the film's thesis clot into something you can hold in your hands. Audience reaction to this film, at least in the communities I've watched online and the theaters where I sat, was the kind of layered conversation you hope for. People carried into the lobby the weight of scenes that did not resolve the way they expected. They argued playfully about which trial revealed the most. They cried quietly during the scene with the dance masks because it felt like an exhale after so many years of watching stories where a hero is only allowed one language, and now here was a man fluent in several who chose the one that preserved his soul. And there is a thread of younger viewers, especially in the diaspora, who turned the film's imagery into art in the days after release, paintings of coins in water like small moons, calligraphy of lines about hunger and dignity, edits set to ribcage-rattling beats where the court steps become an urban choreography you could slide into your morning commute and ride all the way to work. Memes too. It simply allows us to sink into tapestries and the worn wood of a throne carved with histories. It shows how the play of sun off a Kerry's blade can make a small aurora on stone, and it trusts that our eyes will find the movement that matters, an eyebrow lifting, a breath catching, a foot pivoting in a dancing turn, because this is a film that asks the viewer to be a partner in attention, and as a reviewer, I found that refreshing. The way it feels when a film believes you are able to keep up with a world instead of forcing the world to bend toward broad clarity. The first trial at the Husband Selection Festival is not a fight at all, it is a feast, and that decision alone tells you exactly how this film wants to explore its ideas, because a feast is a stage for spending, a stage for restraint, a stage where the way you break bread says more than any quote of lineage. Tables are piled with foods we can almost smell, curries that glisten in clay bowls, green mango with salt and chili, honey poured slow, sticky and golden, jackfruit stained with turmeric, rice that steams like a little mountain cloud, and the suitors are told to serve the women of court before serving themselves, to share first with rivals then with friends, to navigate the etiquette that flays the selfish and reveals the quiet generous. Of course, Udano is spectacular here because he was raised inside this economy of performance. He gives without count, he laughs as he fills bowls to their brim. He orders a whole side table to be moved toward the servants' corridor under the pretense of creating space for more music, and he watches with half-lidded focus as the powerful pretend not to notice and the powerless carry away hot plates in grateful embarrassment, and Princess Aining's gaze meets his for a half-second that is longer than any line in the scene, an acknowledgement that this man understands the theatre of kindness and its dangers. The second trial calls for the suitors to perform a kata of their chosen discipline backed only by breath and floorboard, no live music, no sword singing, and the challenge here is subtle because the court is trained to love spectacle, yet the princess asks for intimacy. She asks these men to show who they are when stripped of trodden pageantry, and some falter, their routines look brittle. But Udano steps forward in a pair of worn trousers and the kind of court tunic that seems borrowed, and what he does is not a kata at first glance, it is a series of motions that look like someone cooking in an open-air kitchen, reaching for a spice, pivoting to pick up a pestle, stirring and then lowering the flame, and the camera circles him in a slow dance as his breath hums, and then the pattern hardens into a silat flow as unflashy as rain deciding where to go on a roof. Only later do we learn that this is a style taught to him by a neighbor many years ago, a woman who sold fish and moved like a tide, and that he hid this practice under the posture of someone who lives in wine and laughter, because that is the film's great pleasure, the way it reveals that the spendthrift mask is not a lie so much as a container, a vessel into which he pours what is required by the hour, yet the vessel has always been lined with steel. Of course, the film does what all good cinematic stories do, it builds us a house of uncertainties, then invites a storm to test it, and that storm arrives as both an antagonist and a revelation, embodied in a figure like a carving come to life, a court champion with a name that rolls like a drum across the hall, a man raised by the head guard, the palace's main mast, who believes himself the rightful center of the selection not because of Princess Aining's favor but because he represents the old way, the way of merit measured in scar and victory, and his scorn for Udano's theatrics is a living thing, something that enters the room before he does, and we understand immediately that the film is setting up a conversation about what strength means, what leadership looks like, whether it is a loud swing of a blade or the quiet reallocation of resources. The champion's brutality is not sadistic, it is procedural, efficient, and his fights are glorious to watch, they are precisely filmed. The camera stepping back to show you the full geometry of body and pole, the choreography more like an argument in crisp lines than a brawl, but there is also, tucked at the edge of those scenes, the princess's caesura, the little pause where we and she ask ourselves whether this is the tradition to continue, whether there is room inside a palace for a man who fights like a poem instead of an axe. When the third trial turns out to be a walk through the city with a blindfold on, a guide tethered to each suitor by a scarf, by pure happenstance Udano is paired with a young palace clerk who reads aloud the names of streets as if they are spells, and the task is not the point is how a man listens, how he allows himself to be led, how he gives up control with dignity, and somehow, because he understands the currency of making himself harmless, Udano begins not to pretend to trust, but to trust, and the script lets the idea bloom slowly, that pretending, worn long enough, can become practice, and practice can become belief, the way an actor becomes his role when the lights settle and the mask is strapped tight to the face, and the clerk, who is our secret favorite by now because he keeps notes in a little book of things he sees the powerful forget, laughs at a joke Udano tells and corrects his step across a drainage gap and murmurs the sound of a kite overhead, and we, sitting in the dark, feel that strange flicker when two people meet in the honest place under pull and strain, and that, if you ask me, is where this film places its heart. There will be viewers who expect the selection to be the entire movie, but Topeng Pemboros is less sport than a throne room fairy tale sodded to a social fable, and we are allowed to meander into the backrooms that make the court run, the kitchens where cumin trails off the end of a ladle and whispers do the work of ink, the practice yards where guards play games with rattan balls in circles the color of dust, and we begin to understand the deeper stakes as rumors roll in from the outlying districts of the kingdom, alliances shifting, clan leaders consolidating fighters, the world of Perselaton reading the princess's selection as an opportunity to remake influence, and the film sketches a portrait of a society at a cusp, one foot in tradition like a dancer in a frozen pose and the other foot searching for a new rhythm. And Udano becomes the accidental midwife for this transition because of his unclassifiable way of being. He has spent so long speaking all dialects of wealth performance that he can move across the necessary thresholds and carry news and change between rooms that do not often share air. I promised myself not to spoil what happens in the last third, because this is a film that gambles on empathy as revelation, not twist for its own sake, but let me say that the palace's language is made to crack open. The spendthrift mask becomes a literal mask in a scene that stages a topeng dance for the court and uses it to puncture a lie crafted by those who depend upon the old order's brutality, and in this act, both performance and politics get tangled and then cleared in a storm of hands and words. Because that is how love and critique travel now. Jokes about Udano's way of paying for a whole table's food and then whispering that he'll just go hungry later. Jokes about Princess Aining's legendary eyebrow and how it could dethrone any tyrant within 3 centimeters of lift, and inside the laughter was the warmth of recognition, a cultural grammar being talked back and forth across screens and city lines. If talk of cultural impact seems too lofty for a single film, I'll risk it anyway because art lives in echoes. Topeng Pemboros landed in 2025 at a moment when Indonesian cinema, after a run of delicious horror and muscular genre pieces, seems to stand with its arms open to the plurality of its traditions, and this film is proudly specific, Javanese court vernacular tucked beside coastal market slang. Batik patterns that are not generic decorations but stories worn on skin, kerries not waved like Fantasy props but handled with the triple care of ritual, weapon, and ancestor, and that specificity is what makes it travel, because the more rooted a tale, the easier it roots in other soils, paradoxically, and you feel the film's care not just in on-screen details but in the way it refuses to flatten its world's politics into a digestible triumph. Instead it offers a gesture of possibility and the knowledge that change is made of maintenance, that whatever the princess begins will require the patient sweat of many hands. I've already heard of martial arts schools using clips of the Carter scene to talk about softness as technique, about spending energy precisely, about the courage it takes to look harmless and then be not harmless when it matters, and that alone is a small cultural shift worth noting in a genre that sometimes overemphasizes bravado at the expense of wisdom. And the title, let's return to it because it's a beauty. Topeng Pemboros suggests a mask of wastefulness, a performed extravagance that hides emptiness, yet the film subverts our reading by showing that Udano's spendthrift habits were never about luxury, they were about camouflage and redistribution, and watching the community begin to mirror his posts of bounty, to treat the excess of a court not as a spectacle but a resource for the hungry, is one of the film's quiet human triumphs. If you see the sequence in the kitchens where a ledger is rewritten, making room for a separate page where leftovers are not accounted as loss but as stock for a public meal, you might think it is too simple, but within the logic of the film's world, it is exactly as radical as a well-placed punch. It is an act of writing as a fight scene, and in that you feel the film's belief that governance is a choreography too. As a viewer who loves the tactile, I want to share a string of small things the film does that deepen its emotional texture: a bowl of soto placed on a tomb with steam still rising into dawn, a doorframe scuffed at thigh height because children turn sideways there when running outside, a deer that wanders into the training yard at dusk and stands listening to the kandang players rehearse until a gust of laughter sends it away. The way the princess's sandals are always clean except once, after a visit to the city's poorest quarter, and she wears the dust as if it is a crown because it is a truth she will not sweep off, and these are the brushstrokes that make a painting feel lived. These are the reasons you come back to a film and it feels like a favorite alley, always the same and always different. I have not yet spoken of the film's boldest set piece, and I won't rob you of its full mirror-polished shine, but there is a fight in the rain hall that is a poem of puddles and tungsten reflections, a study in weight and grace where the choreography is less about winning than about mapping, where every footfall ripples outward, and the grading loves the water so much that you can almost drink it from the screen. It is this fight where Udano's training and his philosophy fuse, and it is this fight where the princess finds her answer not in the most stubborn man but in the one who can be most skillfully soft, and if your heart is like mine, wired to this kind of visual calligraphy, you will have to quiet yourself after, you will have to sit in the credits until the last instrument fades. I want to touch on something else the film does that may not be spotted by everyone on the first go, and that's its treatment of time. It is obsessed with long durations, the length of a meal, the span of a practice, the accumulation of debt over seasons, and because Udano's mask is a daily maintenance, not a flourish, the movie insists that the most important change takes time as well. That a person who has learned to live by spectacle cannot unlearn it in a night, that a court cannot pivot in a week, that the world of Perselaton can stretch its honor and bend without snapping only if given the mercy of months, and that awareness is built into the pace, and though I know some viewers will call it slow, I call it loving, I call it respectful, I call it the tempo of reality clothed in myth. On a technical level, you will appreciate how often the film chooses natural light and lets shadows be honest instead of filling every corner with attractiveness, how the lensing pulls faces into intimacy by being unafraid of pores and wrinkles and sweat, how the set's wood is allowed to squeak and the floor to cough dust when men run. The sound of reeds in riverbank wind is a repeated layer in the mix, a heartbeat at the edge of hearing. And there is an echo of voice in the main throne room. That is left in on purpose, you can tell, to show that decisions made there never really end, they bounce and diminish and return. If you ask me about flaws, because you should, because praise without critique is a kind of empty spend, I'll say that one subplot with a court historian feels underfed, an idea about revisionism that deserved more bite, and a joke about sugarcane that repeats once too often blunts its force, but these are not cracks you can fall into, they are scuffs on a floor that has been danced on all night, and if anything, they remind you that perfection is not the goal here, lived in is, also, there. Will be those who argue that Udano's evolution is too clean, that nobody sheds a mask that elegantly, but if you look closely, the film agrees. It leaves him at the end with habits he will fight for the rest of his life. It leaves us with a picture of him making a small error the day after the big win and then catching himself, and that honesty, to me, lifts the story into a place I trust. So, who is this film for, beyond lovers of martial choreography and court intrigue and the long, keen line of a woman remaking rules? It is for anyone who has ever used a performance to survive. For anyone who has ever been told that masculinity is a blade when sometimes it must be a bowl. For anyone who understands that money is a language and that literacy in it is neither shame nor pride but simply technique. For anyone who wants to feel a story breathe without being forced to sprint. And for anyone who loves cinema that risks the patience of its audience because it believes its audience will choose to sit and taste rather than gulp. If you are a craft person, you'll be rewarded. If you are a heart person, you'll be rescued. If you are both, you'll be wrecked and rebuilt. Final verdicts, the neat kind, feel like a disservice to films like this, but I can offer a feeling. The credits rolled and I felt fuller, not because a story fed me junk sugars but because it gave me proteins of tenderness, complex carbs of craft, fats of memory, and I walked out into a night that felt like the palace's garden, with moisture on the ground and lanterns let down into the trees. And I turned in a circle once because I needed to see if any faces around me wore masks too, and then I smiled because of course we all do, and that is not a condemnation, it is an invitation, the one the film offers as it closes, that we can choose which masks to put down as we go and which to keep for the moments that require them, and maybe that is what stories are for, to walk us to a mirror and give us a second pair of eyes. I love how the film never forgets the boy and the coin and the rain. How it threads the clink of money into the sound of a dancer's ankle bells, how it lets Princess Aing be both crown and hand, and how it writes the world of Persolaton as a living grammar where the rules are strict and the meanings evolve, and I love that it made me want to be kinder with my spendings, with how I spend attention and time as much as what I purchase, because the greatest expenditure a person can make, the film argues quietly, is the choice to see someone fully and to let yourself be seen as something other than your most protective performance. And in that, Topeng Pemboros belongs to the shelf of stories I will take down when I need an example of courage that looks like softness lifting its head in a hard room. Picking up from the last breath we shared in that rain hall glow, the part of Topeng Pemboros that keeps unfolding like a hand-stitched sleeve is how it turns the language of paying into a lexicon of meaning, and once you tune your ear to it, you start seeing microtransactions everywhere, not just in the clamber of coins or the flamboyant orders at banquet tables, but in the trades of looks across a long room. The exchange of breath between fighters before contact, the barter of silence for safety, and the film keeps teaching you to read those trades with patience, because it knows some of the most consequential purchases in life happen invisibly, without ledger, without receipt, and that's why when Udano spends his reputation in one scene, calling in a favor from a boatman he once overpaid on a Fogslow River night, asking for a quiet passage around a checkpoint before dawn, you feel the cost in the hollowness that briefly opens in his chest as he realizes that generosity as armor is just as finite as coin, and the princess, watching from a distance she has established with care, absorbs the lesson too. Theirs is a duet in reciprocation, the movie suggests, not the flashy reciprocity of gifts at court, but the deeper reciprocity of risk and the willingness to be changed in public, because leadership in this story isn't a single blade straight line, it's a weave of many threads that hold when tension tries to pull them apart. Think about how the movie orchestrates space so your body feels the difference between the Kraten's ceremonial corridors, where the sound of your own steps drifts back like a reprimand, and the city's back alleys where feet slap damp stone and laughter is the rough currency of survival. In the palace, characters are framed dead center, held as if within rules scripted before they were born, while in the city, Udano often drifts at the edge of frame like someone trying not to be caught by the camera's tacks. And that language does more than delight a cinephile, it's an emotional skein that knits together the private and the public, says without saying that the self you present is conditioned by architecture and expectation, which is also a way to say, masks are not only chosen, they're accommodated, sometimes imposed by rooms designed to reward them. When the Topeng dancers unfurl their collars and fasten their strings in the middle act and we're invited to watch a performance within the performance, the film gives us the most vivid metaphor for what it's been doing all along, layers watching layers, and the first time Udano puts on a mask in front of the court, there's a second where his eyes stop searching for purchase and surrender, not to a role, but to the relief of being allowed to be overtly artificial, which is an honesty of its own. And I think that is one of the film's gentle provocations, that sometimes artifice can be truer than the polite lies we call respectability, especially in a structure designed to revere tradition at the expense of those who can't afford it. The dancers tell a story of a king who hid among fishermen until he remembered how to listen, and the scene has the delicious dual purpose. Both a joy on its own and a coded rally for a palace that will have to relearn the taste of its people's salt. Every time the princess moves through these moments, the camera gives her permission to be contradictory. There's one sequence where she pauses on a balcony, the city's lanterns stitched across the dark like constellations fallen to earth, and you can feel two minds inside her, one trained on duty and enshrined etiquette, the other humming with new blueprint ideas about power as service rather than spectacle, and the film doesn't force her to choose right there. It lets the process be dignified and messy, and we, as witnesses, are asked to accompany the wobble without demanding a quick fix, to honor the slow burn as a legitimate form of action. I love how the martial grammar of the movie supports that. The fights are rarely one and done and never simply about dominion. They are accumulations of choices, testing, feinting, yielding, and when Udano uses the selendang, the soft scarf that once tethered him in the blindfold walk, as a weapon in a late confrontation, not to choke or bind but to disrupt rhythm, to change breath and find an opening for a conversation, the choreography becomes a thesis statement, softness as a tactical advantage, flexibility as force multiplier, and you watch the champion realize that there is a kind of strength he was never taught to respect, and in that realization, his shoulders shift, his stance lowers, and for a strand of seconds the men become students of each other, their feet tracing a spiral rather than a line, and I swear the floor seems to remember them later. The way it creaks in the same pattern when a single caught bird hops across it the next morning. The film's attention to social strata is compassionate without naive romance. Markets are not just colorful, they're hungry and noisy and august in their own logic, a ledger written in debt and favor and rumor, and the palace is not just rigid, it is afraid and shrewd and sometimes to its own detriment obsessed with a notion of purity it cannot define. Into this breathing map, Udano moves like a liminal species, a translator whose dictionary is embroidered with kindness and misdirection and a knack for reading appetite, and the story is keen to argue that these are not lesser competencies than the ability to swing a blade, they are how cities don't burn. There's a mid-film stretch that haunts me the way a smell haunts a memory, the kitchens at festival height, a batter of grated coconut and rice flour being poured in thin circles on hot plates, the chef with the crooked ear not measuring sugar but tasting, licking the spoon with the grin of someone who knows joy must be imprecise to be real, and Udano slipping in between bustle and banter, learning the route the surplus takes, learning who writes the numbers and who writes the stories to justify them. And there he meets the steward in the grey tunic who appeared earlier like a smudge in the corner of a frame, and now here is his face, lined with loyalty misapplied, and we understand that antagonists in this world are made by years of saying yes to the wrong voice, not by birth, and the movie gives him just enough vision to break your heart when he finally chooses a human over a law written to protect property before people. This is how Topeng Pemboros keeps its characters from turning into flags waved to make a point. It lets them wear their doubts until the weight of certainty hurts less than the weight of pretending. Udano's mother, in flashback fragments, remains the axis around which his choices spin, and I appreciated the restraint, the film not turning her into a saint, letting her be harried and funny and stubborn, the kind of woman who picks up a mask to repair it and sighs in a way that tells you she's thinking about dinner and some small betrayal from earlier in the day. At the same time, we learn, in a quiet reveal, that she once declined a commission from the palace because it came with conditions that would have forced her to use patterns reserved for a family that had not earned them, and that refusal becomes the marrow of Udano's later defiance, a belief that symbolism matters, that ornament is not neutral, that beauty can be violent if it erases the meanings people live by, and this lens helps the film thread its needle through the pomp without getting drunk on it. The score keeps deepening the world too, introducing motifs tied to behavior rather than character, which is such an elegant move. Generosity gets a little wooden clack on the offbeat, cowardice the muffled thrum of a drum heard through a wall, truth-telling that high bell we talked about, and there's a moment when the court tries to reboot its authority by staging a ceremony with all the expected sonic cues, gongs, chimes, a chorus in the back of the room. But because the film has taught us the grammar, we realize the bell is missing, and our bodies know the difference even before our minds register it, and when the bell finally shoots through, it coincides with an act of honesty that ruptures the pageant, reminding us that ear training in a movie can be as political as it is pleasurable. I want to point out the way Princess Aining's wardrobe speaks, because costume here is a text worthy of long reading. Her early sarongs are classic, motifs aligned with ancestral rules, and as she grows in confidence about what kind of ruler she wants to be, her batik choices start to include motifs traditionally worn by people who labor with their hands, seplok patterns that reference rice fields, parang that suggests waves and continuity. And this is not appropriation for the sake of optics but an invitation, a hand extended across a line. There's a scene where an older courtier gently chastises her for it, and the ensuing discussion is free of moral bludgeons, just two minds negotiating a shared love of symbols, and in that the film offers an ethics of change, not smashing the old to make room for the new, but letting the old breathe and adjusting the room so more can walk in. As for the world of porcelain swelling around the palace walls, the movie gives us just enough glints to feel its complexity without dragging us into a legendarium. There are schools with whispers attached, a band of women who fight with blades so narrow they look like rusted hairpins until they flash, men who practice in mangrove at low tide, footwork like the bob and lean of young trees. And these textures matter because when the selection becomes a magnet for all that talent and tradition, you sense how precarious reform is. Any misstep could be read as insult, any brave choice as betrayal, and Udano's contribution becomes less about any single triumph and more about being the conduit through which people can recognize themselves across suspicion. There's a beautiful little container within the film, a subplot about a boy who writes menus for the palace and desperately wants to be a poet, and while I thought at first it was indulgence, I realized later how much it encapsulates the film's thesis. This kid writes with taste, literally, and when he is finally asked to read his dish descriptions aloud in a small circle, the princess closes her eyes and Udano smiles, and the champion exhales the tiniest fraction of his old rigidity, and you feel a kingdom expanding its appetite for what counts as value, as contribution. And I know that sounds lofty for a dish list, but the film's magic trick is convincing you that small expansions add up to durable change. Viewers have been responding to these small expansions, meeting them with their own. After screenings opened in different cities, I saw footage of community kitchens organizing watch parties with meals inspired by the film's recipes. I heard of Scilab practitioners posting videos of their soft forms, naming their drills after puddle maps from the Rain Hall fight. I scrolled through edits where the masked dance was spliced with Wayang shadows to make a new kind of hybrid art that felt reverent and inventive, and it made sense because Topeng Pemboros doesn't just entertain, it invites participation. Even in critique, people debated the time the film gave to the steward's redemption. Some thought it generous, others thought it too rapid, and those arguments felt alive, the kinds of arguments you want because they arise from engagement, not from boredom. The pacing discourse has also sharpened to a point, as it does with films that refuse the sugar highs of constant triumph. I'm not dismissing the thrill of speed. I like a clean sprint as much as anyone, but this movie's run is a distance one, and, like that long walk with the scarf in the city, it tests the audience's capacity for trust, and I appreciate a film that bets on that, because the payoffs land in corners of the heart that bombast can't reach, in the quiet rooms where we decide how to treat each other when there's no stage to impress. Another thing I don't want to forget, humor. It's not a grin-a-minute movie, but it is funny in those ways that humanize rooms where the stakes are steep, a guard muttering that the palace's new rules might require him to finally solve the mystery of his missing sandals, the fishmonger's side-eye when Udano tries to haggle not on price but on gossip, the princess's raised eyebrow becoming a visual joke that the film still uses responsibly, never to belittle her but to let us enjoy her command of the smallest muscle yielding the largest compliance, and those jokes, when they come, are a breath we needed, a reminder that even revolutions require laughter to metabolize fear. Technically, there's a smart restraint with visual effects that I suspect will please purists. Rain looks like rain, not glycerin, cuts do not shout, no one backflips over a table unless that table has been purposefully placed and is ready to be backflipped, and this logic in staging gifts the fights a tactile integrity that bleeds into the drama. You believe that these people can trip and bruise and get back up, and that belief is half the battle when building a world. I noticed too how often the camera allows hands to be protagonists, the seamstress thread, the steward's shaking fingers, the champion's knuckles bearing the pale memories of training, the princess's palm touching a wall before she enters a room to steady her body and her mind, and hand close-ups, used sparingly, become little confessions, a way to say here is the truth beneath posture. When the film brushes up against the broader politics beyond palace walls, it never lapses into lecture. We get the sense of a kingdom negotiating borders with neighbor polities, of rice stores making bad seasons survivable, of taxes being both a necessary communal pool and a potential cudgel, and in that context the selection becomes a ritual that marks not just a partnership but a policy horizon. You can practically hear policy nerds in the audience lean forward as Princess Aing asks a council member not for threats posed by reform but for opportunities made legible by reform, and the line reading there is a quiet duel, the tone conveying a leader aware that fear builds higher walls faster, but seeds sown at the right time with the right water build food for generations. We should talk about the movie's love affair with water because it's more than a texture. The rain hall gets all the ink because it's spectacular, but water runs as metaphor from the first coin rolled across Udano's knuckles to the final cup of tea he pours and chooses not to drink, and the way the camera returns to gullies, gutters, ditches, the moist under of steps, suggests a fascination with infrastructure, the hidden roots that make life possible. That the first generosity we see Udano perform as a man is redirecting a blocked runoff outside a vendor's stall is not an accident, and it finds a quiet rhyme later when he suggests a second door be cut into a storeroom because flow matters not just for water but for power and food and stories. That's the level of metaphor the film indulges in frequently, and if you're allergic to symbol you might itch, but I found it gorgeous because it didn't float off untethered. It always came back to a material choice, a changed hinge, a moved table, a freed drain. In terms of performances around the leads, we could lose ourselves in admiration. The fishmonger mentor embodies grace in sinew, offering one scene in which she teaches Udano to listen to skin rather than to see with eyes, pressing his hands to a tiled floor and making him identify the weight of footsteps above them like notes on a drum, and when that lesson turns into a surprise save later, it lands not as a clever callback but like a story's heartbeat saying, "See, nothing is wasted if you pay attention." The clerk who tethers him with the selendang has an arc that nearly steals the film in two delivery choices, one where he insists on reading a thorny passage in old script aloud to the princess because he believes knowledge belongs out loud, not in locked chests, and another where he locks his little book of notes in that very chest when he realizes he must protect someone else's story before his own. And both are tender contradictions made believable by an actor who knows how to carry kindness in his throat. All that said, there's a craft we haven't touched deeply enough yet, light, and oh, the way light works here, not as a mere illumination but as a moral participant. The dawn light slips enduring apologies, dusk eats bluster like a soft-spoken truth, midday glare exposes lies told with too much confidence, and night wraps conspiracies with the same care it wraps lovers, which means you cannot trust darkness or brightness to mean good or evil. You must trust context, which is the film's way of training us to reject easy binaries, the applause cue of certain genre fare, and instead find our own barometers for integrity within the story. This is generous filmmaking, asking us to exercise muscles that atrophy under spoon-fed exposition. Cultural impact. I can't stop thinking about it because a film like this doesn't just visit, it plants. I came across a dance collective that used the film's mask sequences to question their city street harassment patterns, staging a public performance where men in Topeng turned their faces away when a woman passed, forcing passers-by to think about what attention does, how it can be either predation or protection. And that is an example of art generating action. Similarly, small lenders citing the film, exploring new models where interest is paid in community service hours rather than cash when cash is scarce, a concept lifted from a throwaway line in a scene where Udano jokes that his favorite interests are the ones he can pay with hands. Yes, the risk of reading too much into a movie is real, but I'll take an over-reading engaged citizenry over an under-reading apathetic one any day. And if you want the nerdy connective tissue, the heritage links, the film courts them with humility. Shadows of Wayangkulit fall across a courtyard in a storm, and it's not just pretty, it's a nod to how story has always carried history in silhouette. The Kerries is treated with the triple respect due, a weapon, a right, a relic, and never spun like a weightless toy, and the Topeng masks are handled as conversation partners, with a small ritual spoken before they're lifted, which is not pedantry but a cultural handshake, and it matters not just for accuracy but because story fidelity builds trust, and trust allows the film to take bigger swings later without losing you. Some have asked whether the selection structure ultimately pretends to subvert while actually maintaining the hierarchy. It's a fair question in any tale where a palace invites change, and my answer is that the film is self-aware enough to pose the same challenge inside itself. A scene near the end offers a councilwoman bluntly asking the princess to name what she is willing to lose to win the future she speaks of, and we do not get a tidy list. We get a steady look, a vow to begin, and the admission that beginning is not enough without continuity, and then we're out. And that refusal to let us sleep inside the fiction that decisions are done because one woman is brave is a gift, not a dodge. It keeps us awake to the maintenance work all movements require. Udano's integration into that maintenance is the final measure of his arc, and while I won't spill the nature of his role, I can tell you it honors both the boy with the coin and the man with the ledger, the dancer's son who knows how to be many and the city's friend who knows when to stop performing. The last time he laughs, it's different, less of a strategy, more of a relief. And the movie lets you hear in that laugh the years when laughter was currency and now is just joy, which is a particular kind of wealth no court can tax. If there's a wish I carry, it's for more time with the edges, the hinterlands hinted at, the women's schools, the clans beyond the river, and that wish isn't a complaint so much as a compliment that the world feels bigger than the frame, and if rumors of a companion story are true, not a sequel but a lateral tale set among those mangroves, I'm there for it, because Topeng Pemboros has earned the right to open more doors, and, frankly, because I can't stop listening for that high bell in other movies now, a Pavlovian nudge toward truth that this film taught me to crave. I want to close this leg of our conversation by circling back to the thing this movie did to me personally. It adjusted my sense of where courage lives. I've been trained, like many of us, to honor the loud turn, the shouted no, the big stand, and those deserve honor. But this story asked me to also honor the small yes given at the right time, the quiet change of a ledger line, the breath before a fight where a man decides to throw his weight not forward but aside because the air there is kinder, the woman in a crown choosing not to cut a head but to teach a room to bend, and the way those choices accumulate into something you can feel on your skin, like humidity before rain, and then one day you look up and the world you are in is different from the world you inherited. Topeng Pemboros is not a perfect film, which is to say it is alive. And in its aliveness it offers an ethic of attention I want to carry into my own spending of hours and words, and if you've walked through this with me, whether you're in a theater lobby right now finishing your tea or on a train with the city streaking by, tell me if you felt the bell too, tell me if you saw the puddles draw their alphabets under the fighters' feet, tell me if the masks look back at you as much as you looked at them, because that is the other thing cinema can be, a mirror that doesn't just reflect but suggests a better way to look, and I hope this film travels that way in you. Unfolding and refolding like fabric. Durable, useful, beautiful, equal parts shelter and show.